Elijah Carter stepped onto the plane, his polished shoes clicking softly against the carpeted aisle. He exhaled deeply, still riding the high of a triumphant business trip that had solidified his company's dominance in the tech world. But as he approached the gate, something shifted. The flight attendant at the entrance greeted him with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. She glanced down at his ticket, then back up at him, her expression hardening ever so slightly. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone clipped, "there seems to be an issue with your reservation." Elijah frowned, gripping the handle of his sleek laptop bag tighter. "What kind of issue?" "We've had to reassign your first-class seat due to overbooking," she replied matter-of-factly, avoiding eye contact as she scribbled on a piece of paper. Without waiting for his response, she thrust a new ticket into his hand. "You'll be seated in economy instead." Before Elijah could protest, he noticed two white passengers behind him being ushered forward by another attendant. Their tickets were exchanged smoothly, and they were offered complimentary upgrades to first class without hesitation. A knot formed in Elijah's stomach as whispers rippled through the boarding line, some sympathetic, others mocking. One voice carried louder than the rest. "Guess some people just don't belong up front." The words stung more than Elijah cared to admit. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to react. Instead, he focused on the flight attendant, who now refused to meet his gaze. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I purchased this ticket months ago. This isn't about overbooking, it's about discrimination." The attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "Sir, I'm simply following protocol," she said dismissively before turning away to assist. Another passenger. Her indifference cut deeper than any insult could have. As Elijah made his way toward the economy section, memories flooded back, echoes of a childhood spent fighting against prejudice. He remembered the teacher who told him he'd never amount to anything because of where he came from. The classmates who laughed when he said he wanted to start his own business someday. The landlords who turned him and his family away, claiming their building was full, only to rent to white families moments later. Each memory felt like a weight pressing down on him, reminding him how far he'd come and how much further he still had to go. For Elijah, this wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about respect, about proving to himself and the world that no matter how many obstacles were thrown his way, he wouldn't let anyone take away what he'd worked so hard to achieve. Yet here he was again, facing the same old battle, dressed in a suit that screamed success but couldn't shield him from the sting of systemic racism. He sank into his cramped economy seat, swallowing the lump in his throat. Anger simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over, but he forced himself to stay calm. Letting them see his frustration would only give them power over him. "No," he thought, clenching his fists under the armrests, "this won't define me. Not today." Across the aisle, a man dressed in an impeccably tailored suit watched Elijah intently. His piercing gaze seemed to weigh every detail, the tension in Elijah's shoulders, the controlled fury in his eyes. After a moment, the stranger leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding yet enigmatic. There was something about him, a quiet authority that hinted at knowledge or intentions beyond what met the eye. Elijah caught the movement out of the corner of his eye and glanced over. For a brief second, their eyes locked. The stranger gave a subtle nod, almost imperceptible, before leaning back in his seat. Elijah's brow furrowed. Who was this man? And why did it feel like his appearance wasn't a coincidence? As the plane began boarding other passengers, Elijah tried to shake off the encounter, focusing instead on steadying his breathing. But the stranger's presence lingered in his mind, planting seeds of curiosity and perhaps hope that something unexpected might happen before this journey ended. Elijah sat stiffly in his economy seat, the cramped space feeling even smaller, as whispers trickled through the cabin. A man 2 rows ahead muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Elijah to hear, "Guess they don't want riffraff in first class." The words hit like a slap, sharp and stinging. Elijah clenched his jaw, staring straight ahead, but the comment lingered in his mind, planting seeds of doubt and anger. He reminded himself that this wasn't new. People had been doubting him his entire life, but it still hurt more than he cared to admit. The flight attendant moved down the aisle with a tray of complimentary drinks, handing them out with practiced efficiency. When she reached Elijah, though, she paused and gave him a dismissive glance. "We'll get to you," she said curtly, before moving on without another word. Passengers around him sipped their sodas or adjusted their glasses, pretending not to notice, but Elijah felt the weight of their silence. It wasn't just the drink, it was the message behind the gesture. Even something as simple as a glass of water seemed out of reach for him here. Things escalated when security personnel boarded the plane mid-boarding. They approached Elijah with an air of authority, asking him to step aside so they could verify his ticket. Every eye in the cabin turned toward him. Elijah kept his voice calm as he explained that he'd purchased the ticket months ago, showing them the confirmation email on his phone. The guards eventually nodded and walked away, finding nothing amiss, but the damage was done. Public humiliation burned hotter than private insults ever could. Elijah returned to his seat, his hands trembling. Slightly despite his best efforts to appear composed, Claire Harper reappeared moments later, her presence icy and unyielding. She leaned over Elijah's seat, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Some people think money can buy them status," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. Her words weren't subtle, they were meant to cut, and they did. Elijah swallowed hard, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction, but inside he seethed. Who was she to judge him, to decide where he belonged? Later, in a quiet moment, Claire spoke to one of her co-workers near the galley. "He didn't look like a first-class passenger to me," she said with a shrug. "I figured he'd be happier back here anyway." Her co-worker hesitated, glancing toward Elijah before nodding reluctantly. The casualness of the exchange made it worse. It wasn't personal malice. It was systemic bias woven into every decision she made. Elijah wrestled with what to do next. Part of him wanted to confront Claire, to demand an apology in front of everyone. But another part, the part that had learned to navigate racism his whole life, warned him against it. What good would it do? Would anyone stand up for him, or would they side with her? Instead, he pulled out his phone and texted his assistant, asking her to document everything quietly. As his fingers tapped the screen, he felt a pang of vulnerability. For all his success, moments like this reminded him how fragile his sense of dignity could feel. Across the aisle, Victor Langston leaned forward suddenly, catching Elijah's attention. "I saw what happened earlier," he said in a low, steady voice, his piercing gaze locked onto Elijah's. "Don't worry, justice will be served." Elijah blinked, unsure how to respond. Was this man offering help, or was he playing some kind of game? Before Elijah could ask, Victor excused himself and disappeared into the lavatory. The cryptic promise left Elijah uneasy but intrigued. Flashbacks began flooding Elijah's mind, memories of similar struggles throughout his life. And then, unexpectedly, glimpses of Victor's past surfaced too. He saw Victor sitting in a boardroom, being talked over by colleagues who dismissed his ideas because of his race. He saw Victor standing alone at networking events, ignored by people who only noticed the color of his skin. These shared experiences connected them, hinting at a deeper purpose behind Victor's involvement. This wasn't just about Elijah, it was about something bigger. Meal service brought fresh humiliation. Claire arrived with a pot of coffee, deliberately spilling it on Elijah's shirt as she handed him a cup. "Oops," she said with a smirk. "Maybe next time you'll dress appropriately for the coach." Elijah froze, heat rising to his cheeks. Around him, passengers shifted uncomfortably, murmuring disapprovingly, but doing nothing. Their silence spoke volumes, underscoring the complicity that allowed racism to thrive unchecked. Frustration boiled over as Elijah grabbed his phone and recorded the incident, posting it online with a caption calling out the airline's discriminatory practices. Within minutes, hashtags like "Justice for Elijah" began trending globally. Messages of support poured in, giving him a small measure of solace. Still, Claire doubled down, storming over to his seat. "If you cause any more trouble, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the flight," she threatened, her voice low but venomous. Elijah stared at her, torn between outrage and restraint. Letting her win wasn't an option, not anymore. As social media amplified his story, passengers started questioning their own silence. One woman whispered to her companion, "Why didn't we say anything?" Another man shook his head, muttering, "This is wrong." The tide was turning, slowly but surely, setting the stage for a reckoning aboard the flight. Elijah noticed the shift, feeling a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. No matter what happened next, he knew his voice was being heard beyond the confines of this plane. That knowledge gave him strength and a reason to keep fighting. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Claire's voice crackled over the intercom, sharp and unwavering. "Attention, passengers. We regret to inform you that one individual has caused disruptions aboard this flight and must be removed immediately." The announcement sent a ripple through the cabin. Elijah felt his stomach drop as two security guards approached him with grim expressions. Passengers started, some in shock, others recording the scene on their phones. Elijah stood slowly, his heart pounding, trying to maintain his composure. He glanced at the faces around him, some sympathetic, most silent, and wondered how many would speak up if given the chance. As he was escorted down the narrow aisle, whispers spread like wildfire. "This isn't right," someone muttered softly. But no one moved to intervene. Just as Elijah reached the exit door, a commanding voice cut through the tension. "Stop!" Everyone turned to see Victor Langston rising from his seat, his presence radiating authority. "If he goes, the rest of you stay grounded," Victor declared firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The words hung heavy in the air, freezing everyone in place. For a moment, there was only silence. Victor stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Claire's. "I'm Victor Langston, CEO of Global Airways, and I demand an explanation for what I've just witnessed." His declaration sent gasps rippling through the cabin. Claire faltered, her confident demeanor crumbling under the weight of his glare. Passengers exchanged stunned looks, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Without waiting for Claire's response, Victor gestured toward the plane's entertainment screens. With a few taps on his phone, footage of Claire's earlier actions began playing aloud. Her dismissive remarks, the spilled coffee, her refusal to serve Elijah fairly. Gasps erupted throughout the cabin as the truth became undeniable. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, murmuring angrily. One woman exclaimed, "This is unbelievable." Another man shook his head, muttering, "How could she think she'd get away with this?" The outrage grew louder, turning into chants of Elijah's name. "Justice for Elijah!" Voices rang out, echoing through the cabin. It wasn't just anger, it was solidarity. People who had stayed silent before now found their voices, demanding accountability. Elijah stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden wave of support. At that moment he realized he wasn't alone anymore, but Victor wasn't done yet. Turning back to Claire, he dropped another bombshell. "Let me tell you something else," he said, his voice cold and cutting. "Your husband works in our legal department. We know about the incidents you've covered up in the past. You're not just guilty of discrimination, you're part of a system that perpetuates it." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Passengers exchanged horrified glances, while Claire paled visibly, her hands trembling. The pilot emerged from the cockpit, his face stern. Addressing the cabin, he announced, "Until this matter is resolved, I refuse to fly." His decision drew murmurs of approval from the passengers. Even the flight attendants seemed uneasy, shifting nervously as the weight of the situation settled over them. The airline's corporate office quickly intervened via live stream, issuing a public apology. "We deeply regret these actions," a representative said hurriedly. "Claire Harper has been terminated effective immediately." With Claire escorted off the plane, Victor personally accompanied Elijah back to first class. As they walked down the aisle together, passengers broke into applause. Some stood, offering nods of respect, while others simply clapped quietly, tears in their eyes. When Elijah finally sank into his rightful seat, he felt a mix of emotions, relief, pride, and an overwhelming sense of vindication. As the plane began its ascent, Elijah gazed out the window, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about the humiliation, the anger, and the triumph that followed. Silently, he vowed to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who faced similar injustices. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Around him, passengers exchanged nods and quiet words of solidarity. "Did you see that?" one whispered. "Things need to change." Another nodded fervently. "They will," came the reply. The shared experience had united them, creating a bond that transcended the confines of the aircraft. Victor sat across the aisle, watching silently. There was a fire in his eyes, a quiet determination that hinted at larger plans ahead. He knew this incident was just one battle in a much bigger war. Leaning back in his seat, he pulled out his phone and began drafting an email to his executive. "Team, change would start here, mid-air, with this flight serving as both a reckoning and a promise." For Elijah, the journey from humiliation to empowerment felt complete. Yet he understood that true change required more than personal victories. It required persistence, courage, and collective action. As the plane soared higher, so did his resolve. Seeds of hope had been planted, not just within him, but among every passenger who now saw the power of speaking out against prejudice. The climax ended not with closure, but with a promise. Transformation was coming, and it would reach far beyond this flight. Elijah stood at the podium, his posture steady, but his hands gripping the edges tightly. To his right was Victor Langston, whose presence commanded attention without effort. The room buzzed with reporters and cameras, all eager to hear what they had to say about the events that had unfolded on Flight 427. Elijah took a deep breath before speaking, his voice calm yet filled with conviction. "This isn't just about me," Elijah began, pausing briefly as if weighing each word carefully. "It's about every person who has ever been told they don't belong because of the color of their skin. It's about dismantling systems that allow discrimination to thrive unchecked." Victor stepped forward next, his tone authoritative but tinged with emotion. "Today, we're announcing a $10 million initiative aimed at combating racial bias in the aviation industry and beyond." He paused, letting the significance of the pledge sink in. "This will fund training programs for airline staff, stricter accountability measures, and independent oversight to ensure incidents like this never happen again." The crowd erupted into murmurs of approval, pens scribbling furiously across notepads, but Elijah wasn't finished. He leaned closer to the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "For years, I fought battles professionally, against doubters, competitors, skeptics, but nothing cuts deeper than personal attacks rooted in prejudice. This experience reminded me how far we still have to go." His voice softened, cracking, slightly under the weight of vulnerability. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if it was worth fighting back. But then, I remembered, silence only empowers injustice. Today, we proved that standing together can spark real change. Applause rippled through the room, growing louder as Elijah delivered his closing statement. Discrimination thrives when good people remain silent. Let this moment remind us all that our voices matter and that unity is our greatest weapon against hate. As the press conference wrapped up, Elijah and Victor shared a quiet moment backstage. Victor sighed deeply, shaking his head. No, I was ready to retire, he admitted, surprising Elijah. I've done my time, built my legacy, but after seeing what happened to you... He trailed off, his expression thoughtful. I realized this is my chance to reshape an industry I care deeply about, to make sure no one else has to endure what you did. Elijah nodded, understanding the gravity of Victor's decision. That takes courage, he said simply. And leadership. People look up to you. Seeing you step back into the fight inspires others to do the same. Back at his office later that day, Elijah was greeted by cheers from his team. Balloons floated near the ceiling, and someone had brought cake. For a brief moment, Elijah allowed himself to smile, basking in the warmth of their support. But as the celebration died down, he retreated to his desk, staring out the window at the city skyline. He thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the anger, the triumph, and silently vowed to keep pushing forward. This victory was important, yes, but it was also fleeting. There were bigger battles ahead, ones that couldn't be won with hashtags or applause alone. He picked up his phone and typed out a message to his assistant. Let's start drafting proposals for advocacy groups. We need to amplify more stories. Like mine. When his team gathered around him again, Elijah spoke firmly but kindly. We should celebrate today's win, but not too much. This is just one battle in a much larger war. Our work doesn't end here, not even close. Later that evening, Elijah sat down with his team to reflect on the lessons learned. Every story matters, he told them earnestly. Mine got attention because of where it happened and who was involved. But there are countless others waiting to be heard. If we want real change, we have to lift those voices up. One team member raised her hand hesitantly. How do we start? She asked. Elijah smiled, grateful for her willingness to engage. By sharing our own experiences first, then by creating spaces where others feel safe doing the same. Change starts small, but it grows fast when enough people believe in it. Word of the incident spread quickly, sparking conversations worldwide. Social media lit up with posts, from people recounting their own encounters with racism in travel and other areas of life. News outlets ran editorials questioning policies that perpetuate inequality. Even within airlines, employees began demanding better training and accountability. Elijah watched these developments unfold with cautious optimism. He knew systemic racism wouldn't crumble overnight, but seeing so many people inspired to act gave him hope. At a community event a few weeks later, he addressed a packed auditorium. Resilience and authenticity can challenge even the deepest-rooted prejudices, he declared. But it takes action, not just words, to create lasting change. As the story drew to a close, both Elijah and Victor reflected on the legacy they hoped to leave behind. Over coffee one morning, Victor looked at Elijah and said, "We may not see the full impact of what we've started in our lifetimes, but if we pave the way for future generations to inherit a fairer world, that's enough." Elijah nodded, sipping his drink thoughtfully. "Truth and dignity always prevail," he said quietly, echoing the sentiment that had carried him through. "Especially when people unite for change." And with that, the narrative concluded, not with finality, but with a promise. The fight for justice would continue, fueled by the courage of those willing to stand up and speak out. Have you ever faced discrimination while traveling? Share your story below. Every voice matters. What would you have done in this situation? Keep watching to see how justice was served. If you think this was shocking, wait until you see what happens next. Click here to watch our next video. You won't want to miss it. Racism still exists in so many forms, from airports to workplaces. It's not enough to just acknowledge it. We need action. Help us spread awareness by liking and sharing this video. Every click brings us closer to change. No matter how deep, injustice runs, truth and dignity always prevail, but only when we stand together. Let's keep fighting for a future where no one has to endure these injustices again. Together, we can rewrite the rules and build a fairer world. Your support makes all the difference.